I wish to welcome you to this evening lecture, which is sponsored by the Religious Studies program of Iowa State University, along with the departments of History and Political Science and Philosophy, and also partly by the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the student government. I think while I'm talking, I will ask you, especially people just back a bit, to move forward, and I think we'll have a better setting for our speaker. I know how I feel when an introducer makes that request, but to get over that feeling and just come up, beginning with my colleague in the back row. We are fortunate to have Professor Spaulding with us from the University of Iowa, who is the director of the School of Religion there. Some of you may not be aware that at the University of Iowa there is a School of Religion, and that there has been for the past 50 years. As a matter of fact, I think about a year or two ago, I received a document from Melvin Seinhorst of the state of Iowa proposing that we here should renew the charter of the School of Religion at Iowa State University. And I think maybe he had similar troubles that President Ford did about identifying places recently. Our guest has as his area of concentration religious history, especially modern in the period of the Renaissance and Reformation, Western religious history, Christian history, and has been working in this area for a number of years, even though, as we discovered at the supper table, that he began in electrical engineering or chemical engineering. But he made the comment that he thought that that was a good preparation for doing a study of religion and theology, because it gave him good training in bringing order out of chaos, which is, of course, what many of us have to do right along, whether we're in religion or not, in the study of religion. But he has been at the University of Iowa for 20 years as a professor, and since 1971 as the director of the School of Religion. He participates in a wide variety of activities in the scholarly world, belonging to such organizations as the American Academy of Religion, the American Society for Reformation Research, the American Society of Church History, and the 16th Century Studies Conference, of which he was the president in 1975. And he has published many materials in the area of religious history in the period of the Renaissance and Reformation. This afternoon he presented to us a paper on the background of the thinking of religious people in the time of our own American Revolution, and how that how there were parallels to what was said there by religious spokesmen in that period, how there were parallels to what had preceded in English history. And tonight, I really do think that Professor Spaulding is going to attempt to bring together widely, at least what appears to be widely separate materials: the Bible, freedom, and revolution, biblical themes of freedom as background for bicentennial celebration of American independence. So that we look forward to your presentation, Professor Spaulding, on that comprehensive subject. We're happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I would like to begin by saying that among the people for whom I have the highest respect and admiration today are two people by the name of Sidney Meade and William Stringfellow. Sidney Meade is a retired professor from the University of Iowa. He's a person with great affinities for Carl Sandburg and Abraham Lincoln because of his own background. At the age of 25, he did not yet know what a college was, but he has had since then a distinguished career at the University of Chicago, at the Claremont Graduate School, and of course the University of Iowa, as probably the foremost interpreter of the religious dimensions of American history. William Stringfellow, by contrast, is a blue-blooded Ivy Leaguer who turned down the usual Wall Street role accepted by graduates of the greatest of American law schools to become a civil rights and human rights lawyer in East Harlem, and later a peace activist, and still later a person who is enjoying what he calls a second birth after what had seemed to be an incurable and fatal disease. Now, both of these people, Sidney Meade and William Stringfellow, have as a primary concern the task of interpreting the role of religion in American life. And both have accepted the fact that there are two basic American religious traditions: the religion of the Republic on the one hand, and the religion of the churches, sects, denomination, and synagogues on the other. Both of these people see unresolved tensions between Christian faith on the one hand and that civil religion which has undergirded our Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and our national hopes and aspirations on the other. In his recent book, The Nation with the Soul of a Church, Sidney Meade sees the tension to be between the universalism of the religion of the Republic, based upon the Enlightenment faith of the founders of the American nation, people such as Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton, Madison, and so on. And he sees this to be in contradiction with the particularisms of doctrine, which Meade believes are largely inherited from Europe, which inform the churches, the sects, and the denominations. Now, in this contradiction or this tension, Sidney Meade has a decided preference for the religion of the Republic. And I might add for this audience that this Enlightenment religiosity, which has taken form in what Meade calls the religion of the Republic, is also what Michael Novak calls the tradition in which intellectuals ordinarily define themselves. In other words, it is also the religion that informs the mentality of presidents, deans, and professors, by and large, in our state universities and in our great private institutions. Well, from this basis and in the face of this tension, Sidney Meade challenges the spokesman for the Christian tradition to work on the task of resolving the contradictions between the two basic religions of America. Now, this contradiction is blissfully unobserved by most people. And this was empirically demonstrated, according to Mead, in a massive study undertaken recently by the three major Lutheran denominations in this country. They sought through the resources of current sociology to get a profile of Lutherans in America in the three major Lutheran denominations. And it was discovered, among other things, that 3/4 of Lutherans in America affirm that all religions lead to the same God. Now, this is an affirmation of the Enlightenment religion, of the religion of the Republic. But at the very same time, 3/4 of Lutherans in this country affirm that belief in Jesus Christ is absolutely necessary for salvation. This is a particularistic doctrine of their Christian tradition. This means that at least 50% of Lutherans in America are happily living with a basic contradiction in their beliefs. And Sidney Mead would challenge the spokesman for the denominations to work to resolve this contradiction, which is by no means a special problem of Lutherans, who are at least as theologically sophisticated as other American churches, sects, and denominations. Now, Sidney Mead would personally resolve the contradiction by affirming the Enlightenment faith of the founders of the American Republic. William Stringfellow, in contrast to Mead, has recently published his position in a book entitled Ethics for Christians and Other Alienated People. Here, Stringfellow interprets the religion of the Republic, or civil religion, to be simply another mask for the essentially demonic and idolatrous state which is symbolized as the great beast in Revelation 13. I remind you that Stringfellow is an Ivy Leaguer, and he speaks from that context when he speaks this way. The physical and spiritual scars that Stringfellow personally bears from his activities in working for the human rights of oppressed minorities in New York City, which he bears as a result of his activities in civil rights and peace movements. These scars were largely inflicted upon him by the official agents of a national state that was intent upon destroying whatever effectiveness Stringfellow and others like him have had in their efforts to bring about a better justice and a more tolerable human situation for the oppressed. Long, long ago, he had discovered that in East Harlem, my people, that is WASP, Ivy Leaguers, my people, is the enemy. Now he feels that the only proper view for Christians and other alienated people to take is to see the state as essentially demonic in whatever form it takes. This feeling toward the state does not refer simply to this or that particular totalitarian state, but it is true of any state. I have a little feeling for this when I think of Picasso's great painting, Guernica. Now, I've seen this painting over many, many years, when it first came to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And of course, my first impression of this painting was, isn't that awful the way those Nazis and fascists are, you know? Today, I realize that that painting Guernica is not just about Nazis and fascists, it's about us. We're the ones who are depicted in Guernica. We're the ones involved in the obliteration bombing of civilian populations, and so on. So that Stringfellow says it's not simply that this or that totalitarian state is the demonic state described in Revelation 13, but any state is this. Therefore, says Stringfellow, it is the proper activity of the alienated to be in fundamental opposition to the state at whatever point they come into contact with it. If Christian people do not feel alienated, they understand neither their Christian faith nor the nature of the enemy. Now, of course, the religion of the 18th century Enlightenment, or the religion of the Republic, has a view of the state which sees the state as the practical agency through which justice in the world is ultimately realized. Now, this afternoon in a lecture I mentioned how the current German theologian of consequence, Jürgen Moltmann, gave a lecture a week or two ago in America on his impression of America. And it's only this, but he said Americans seem to become either messianists or apocalypticists. These are the two tendencies. The messianists, he says, are those who have a future hope which is combined with faith in its own realizability. And the apocalypticists are those Americans who sense a future anxiety which is combined with faith in the realizability of its worst fears. Now, the founders of the American Republic and Sidney Meade belong obviously to the first category, the messianists, the ones with a future hope combined with a faith in its own realizability. But Stringfellow, and not without many sad experiences, belongs among those who have a future anxiety which is combined with faith in the realizability of its worst fears. Now, of course, at least 50% of Lutherans, according to statistics, and probably most of the rest of us, are living a contradiction in between these two categories, reflecting now one and now the other, depending upon how the question is asked of us. And probably this dilemma of most of us has something to do with why many people don't know how they're going to vote next week. But it's in facing up to this dilemma that I would have us look in this bicentennial year celebrating the American Revolution. It is in facing up to this dilemma that I would have us look at the themes of freedom which are to be found in the Bible. It is from the Bible that both the universalistic religion of the Republic, on the one hand, and the doctrine of the various sects, churches, and denominations in America take their inspiration. Biblical themes of freedom are very much the inspiration of Stringfellow's ethics for the alienated, and biblical themes of freedom are very much a part of the religion of the Republic. And I would affirm that basically the themes of freedom informing the religion of the Republic are from the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. And basically the themes of freedom informing the ethics for the alienated come from William Stringfellow's long and careful study of the New Testament, which goes back to his undergraduate years at Yale University under the great New Testament scholar Paul Minear. Whether or not Christian spokesmen can solve the dilemma posed to them by Meade or by Stringfellow is going to relate closely to how well those same spokesmen are able to develop a meaningful relationship between the Old and the New Testaments. So let us now review the themes of freedom to be found in the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian Old Testament. And of course, roots for the freedom theme, wherever it is to be found, are ultimately in that biblical story of the Exodus from Egypt, the liberation of a people from bondage. On July 4, 1776, not only was a Declaration of Independence signed in Philadelphia, but wherever 2 or 3 Americans gather together, a committee is formed, and so it was formed on this day. And the committee that was formed was a committee of 3 men, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, to design a great seal for the new republic. What a committee. Now, both Franklin and Jefferson wanted to have pictured on that seal the people of Israel being liberated from Egypt. Now, neither Jefferson nor Franklin can properly be called churchmen, but they were both devotees. Well, they were founders, founding fathers of the religion of the Republic. And they saw the freedom theme, which was declared in the Declaration of Independence, as being born in the deliverance of Israel from bondage. The eventual design of the Great Seal, which appears on every dollar bill, depicts the goal of that liberation, the new order of the ages in the promised land. You can get your dollar bill out and look on the back side, and there it is. Not only does the story of the Exodus, though, provide inspiration to the oppressed themselves, but it reminds the oppressed, once set free, to have a concern for the oppressed in their midst. Hence, in Exodus 23, verse 9, it is stated, "You shall not oppress an alien, for you know the heart of an alien, for you were an alien in the land of Egypt." In other words, not only are the roots of the religion of the Republic in the story of the Exodus, but William Stringfellow's Christian identification with the alienated and the oppressed finds its earliest support in the story of the Exodus and the implications from that. Now, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, the story of the freed people is not simply a story of human triumph over enslavement. For the prophetic books in that Bible remind us that liberated people can and do become themselves oppressors. The prophet Amos was to discover 2,500 years before William Stringfellow that my people is the enemy. However, I would insist that this awareness is also to be found in some of the more perceptive proponents of the religion of the Republic. I would remind you of John Quincy Adams, carrying on a lonely fight against slavery in the House of Representatives long after he had been repudiated as President of the United States, and making his last dramatic speech before dying in the House in 1848. He was an Amos to our nation as he decried the American imperialism that was waging an unjust war against Mexico. And he decried this awarding of all kinds of medals to the officers who have participated in this unjust war. And of course, another Amos was Abraham Lincoln, who lost his seat in Congress for opposing that war against Mexico. And as you well know, in his second inaugural address, Lincoln spoke like an Old Testament prophet in declaring the Civil War to be the awful consequence to a nation which had failed to be true to its commitment to liberty and justice for all. Now, neither Lincoln nor Adams could be called churchmen, but they did bear allegiance to the religion of the Republic. And through them, this biblical prophetic voice, owing allegiance to freedom, could be heard. So that here in this basic Hebrew understanding of freedom, we find roots both for the religion of the Republic and for the Christian faith of a man like Stringfellow, who feels that the religion of the Republic is simply a mask for idolatry. Now, of course, the story in the Hebrew Bible goes on, and the nation of Israel was destroyed by first the Assyrians in the north and then the Babylonians in the south. And so you had once again a nation of aliens in foreign lands, of displaced persons. And in this period of national humiliation, there was a prophet of the exile whose writings are found in the latter part of Isaiah, who saw meaning even in this destruction of the nation, even in this national humiliation, and saw that this people, which had become once again aliens in foreign lands, which had become displaced persons, saw in that very happening opportunity to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of prison to those who are bound. That their being scattered among the nations of the earth gave them the opportunity to proclaim liberty to all nations, and not simply to their own, without any military might, neither quenching the smoking flax, nor breaking the bruised reed, armed only with the sword of the Spirit, which is the spoken word. They could faithfully proclaim liberty throughout all lands and to all of humankind. And I would maintain that similarly Abraham Lincoln saw in the traumatic consequences of the war between the states the opportunity for what he called a new birth of freedom. So that, again, in this kind of humiliation that we've recently gone through, which we speak of in terms of Vietnam and Watergate, the attitude which informs the Hebrew Bible and which at least some in the religion of the Republic have been sensitive to, as well as people like Stringfellow. There is the possibility for a new kind of reflection in terms of our purpose as a people, and the possibility, again, for what might be termed a new birth of freedom, if we are able to read the signs of the time. Now, how about the New Testament? I would say, first of all, that the New Testament and the Old Testament are indelibly linked together. And just at this point where we have been speaking. And I would refer you, of course, to Luke's story of the first sermon that Jesus gave in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, where they read from this Isaiah 61, and it says there, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set at liberty to those who are oppressed." And according to Luke, Jesus identified himself with that precise vocation. And as you know from the story, the congregation did not hear him gladly when he identified this mission with people in the world whom the congregation rejected as being outside the pale. But as long as there are alienated, imprisoned people, this kind of message, which comes from the prophetic tradition in the Hebrew Bible, will be both good news to the poor and a prophetic judgment upon the affluent and the powerful. And William Stringfellow owes much to this same prophetic tradition. But when you take the New Testament as a whole, it seems to me that you have a quite different historical situation from what you find by and large in the Hebrew Bible. For in the Hebrew Bible, there was this feeling that the nation Israel was a kind of pilot project in the world, bringing to the world new possibilities in human life and human understanding. And at the time of the New Testament, it is almost impossible for people in the church, I mean the people who are responsible for the books of the New Testament, which were written, of course, a generation at least after the time of Jesus. It is practically impossible for them to think in terms of playing any responsible role in the state. The state is the Roman Empire. And Jesus has quite clearly rejected the zealot possibility, that is, to raise up the righteous people in a revolution as just another zealot revolutionary to be done to death. But the early church had rejected that as a real possibility, revolution. But they saw themselves as existing in a Roman Empire where they had practically nothing to say about the state. They did not sit in Caesar's seat. They were a tiny, little minority group. And as time went on, they began to be more and more oppressed. And so the basic New Testament themes of freedom seem to be somewhat different from what we find in the Hebrew Bible. But remember what I've said, that the Hebrew Bible is tied into the New Testament in the person of Jesus himself, who is still proclaiming those Old Testament freedom themes. And so you find in John's Gospel Jesus pictured as he talks to a group of Pharisees who regard themselves as experts on the tradition of freedom. He is pictured as saying that if you take seriously what I'm saying and follow what I'm doing, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And when he's challenged as to what he means by that, the author of John's Gospel has Jesus talk to them about bondage to sin and being freed from that. And then the question comes, does this have any relevance to either the religion of the Republic or what Stringfellow is talking about? And of course it does. For if there is to be this external liberation, there must be liberation from the oppressor within. Sin is enslavement to the false gods. And when material wealth or sensual pleasure or national self-interest or power become a god or gods for human beings, we enter a slavery. Sin is idolatry, and this is the tendency of all national states to think of themselves as though they were all important. We miss the whole point if we think of idols simply as those impotent wooden and stone images which are ridiculed in the book of Isaiah. And sins of omission and commission are the result of sin as such, and by focusing on sins rather than sin, we fail to see the root of the bondage. The sins which produced Watergate and the Vietnam War, the unconstitutional acts of the executive branches of the United States government, the fraud involved in grain inspection in New Orleans, and so on, is the result of a commitment to goals which are quite short of justice for all of humankind which is what the kingdom of God and its righteousness is about. The bondage that the so-called hard-nosed businessman, practical politician creates oppresses far more than simply that person himself. It oppresses many, many other people down the line. So there is some need for a freedom from this kind of bondage to idolatry, bondage to sin. And Stringfellow has some insight as to what this is about. And you go further in the New Testament and read Paul's letters, and you find that this freedom also involves freedom from the law. So he says, you brothers and sisters were called to freedom. Do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And he talks about freedom from bondage to the law, which sounds almost preposterous to us today, where people are so concerned about lawlessness. And I'm not talking just about the lawlessness in Washington or the lawlessness on the streets of our great cities, but there is also what the great Jewish sociologist from France called anomie, writing in the 19th century, living without the law, this state of being which is produced when an old culture is dying and a new culture is not yet born. My first job was on an Indian reservation many long years ago now. And there was this anomie, this lawlessness. People didn't know what to do because the old culture was gone. It was simply the old folks who could still live by those Indian traditions of the past. And they hadn't really accepted the new culture that had pushed in around them. And I found, as a Midwestern WASP, white American Anglo-Saxon Protestant, I found shocking what I saw to be lawlessness, But now I've come to realize that we're all on that Indian reservation, that this situation of anomie is something that is experienced, particularly by young people in Ames and in Iowa City and throughout the world. An old culture with its forms and its mores is dying, and the new is not yet here. And to suggest to people when this is a problem that freedom from the law is something meaningful seems almost ridiculous, and yet this is what Paul is talking about. And of course, when you look at Paul personally, you find that Paul was a super legalist. He was a person who, as a young person, must have been very insecure about his own acceptance. If you can imagine this Jewish boy coming from this town of Tarsus, which he thought was no mean city, but the fellows in Jerusalem had never heard of it, Growing up, speaking Greek and so on, he comes to Jerusalem where his folks think he can get a good Jewish education, and those native Palestinian Jewish boys say, that Paul thinks he's a Jew, but he dresses funny, doesn't he? And did you ever hear his accent when he reads the Torah? And that haircut, wow. You see, so insecure in his own personal self-acceptance, he tried to prove himself to his fellows. He tried to become super Jew, And it was only when he had this very strange experience on the Damascus Road that he found freedom, from trying to have to prove himself anymore. Because Paul had personally experienced bondage to a tradition in which he was raised and from which he had to be freed. He could talk about freedom from the law. But this is something that all of us need if we are going to act freely in our culture today, in the sense that each of us has a history, whatever it is, and it's different with each one of us. And if we are being determined in the decisions we make by that past of ours, instead of being able to make a choice in terms of the options before us, in terms of what is best, we are slaves. We are in bondage to that past of ours. And it isn't just the Apostle Paul, then, who speaks to us of freedom from the law. And the anomie of the late 20th century cannot be overcome simply by reaffirming the law, however good the law may be. Paul pointed out that because of sin, because of idolatry, its stricter enforcement simply intensifies the problem, that we will never solve crime in the streets or crime in Washington by stricter enforcement alone. So in terms of our national problems, it seems to me that this matter of freedom from the law has something to say to the religion of the Republic, and not simply to a particularistic Christian group. And of course, finally, in the New Testament, they speak of freedom from the fear of death, which I find in particular in the letter to the Hebrews, but it's in other places, where you have this matter of people who are in bondage to some kind of idolatry, to some kind of thing which is regarded as all important when it is not really all important, because of the basic insecurity in life that is symbolized by the fact of death. And this is something that all of us face. And the thing about William Stringfellow that I know and can say that and underline it is that here is a person who has had to face death in its most gruesome form. I can remember one day when he was speaking at the University of Iowa. It was on a Friday. And he looked like the figure of death itself, just skin and bones. And he said that on Monday he was going to enter a hospital in New York. And he knew that this was the end, that the only way he would come out of this hospital was on a stretcher in a funeral cab. But somehow or other it didn't happen, and he's alive. But here's a person who has had to face death down. And I would insist that a person who is able to do that, and has done this, is a person who has a freedom that most of us do not yet have. And again, it's something that has something to do with our national life, and not simply a matter of our particular religious faith, our Christian faith, or our Jewish faith, or whatever. There's an interesting statement that E.M. Forster made in 1939 in a radio message over the British Broadcasting Company. And this was a dim time. The fall of 1939, World War II had started. And Forster said this: "The people I respect most behave as if they were immortal and as if society were eternal." Now, said Forster, both assumptions are false, but both of them must be accepted as true if we are to go on eating and working and loving, and are to keep a few breathing holes open for the human spirit. Now, certainly we are not immortal, but something is. God is. And society is not eternal, but there are eternal values. And people who have been freed from the fear of death because they are willing to affirm what is eternal can help us all to go on eating and working and loving, and also to keep a few breathing holes open for the human spirit. And this has something to say about our national life and its possibilities, that keeps us going even when everything seems to be defeated and going wrong. Now, I would say that the roots of the religion of the Republic stretch back to the Hebrew Bible. The roots of Stringfellow's ethics for Christians and other alienated people stretch back there. I would also say that New Testament Christianity took form under the conditions of persecution and martyrdom, and that the stances toward the state advocated in the New Testament are helpful to people who live under a dictatorial rule, a rule by a Caesar who is all-powerful. But is the New Testament as helpful in political advice to people living in the American Republic? Must we only see in it what Stringfellow sees, the willingness to oppose the state at every point? And I would say we, the people of the United States, are in some sense sovereign. And on Tuesday we have something to do with that sovereignty. We are in some sense collectively in Caesar's seat. So that in opposing what we regard to be demonic tendencies in the state, we're also opposing demonic tendencies in ourselves. Now, in a somewhat different setting, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German resistance leader in prison, writing from prison, knowing that he had a sentence of execution passed against him, felt drawn to the reading of the Old Testament. And he states that the Old Testament hope was basically this worldly. The prophets in the Old Testament savored of days of peace and justice, where humankind can enjoy the goods of this life, here and now in this world. And Bonhoeffer personally longed so much for these goods that he could almost taste them. But at the same time, he was a person who had an ultimate confidence in the eternal God, who transcended his own sense of sin and guilt, his fears and anxieties, in the face of a grisly and absurd death by execution. Now, Bonhoeffer maintained that his delight in the goods of this world were very real at this time. They were never more real than he was in prison. How he longed to enjoy good friends and good food and good human relations, and we didn't learn until many years later that he was engaged to be married, and we didn't know that at the time, and he longed for the consummation of that marriage. And this made particularly poignant his own hope. But he says, in reflecting upon his reading of the Old Testament in relation to his understanding of the New, it is only when one loves life and the earth so much that without them everything seems to be over, that one can believe in the resurrection and a new world. Now I ask you, what was the good news that Dietrich Bonhoeffer longed to hear from outside of prison? Was it a statement of confidence that God would take him up into his eternal kingdom? No. But it was the news that the power of Hitler is being destroyed, and that there is a new possibility for some breathing space, a new possibility for a better justice for humankind. This was the good news he longed to hear. And I have a New Testament reference there too. It is where John the Baptizer is in prison, and he's under sentence of death, an absurd death and a grisly death. And John the Baptizer sends out this question to Jesus: "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look to another?" Now I ask you, what is the response? Does Jesus send back, "Oh, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die"? Not at all. Not at all. His answer is the identical answer that Bonhoeffer wanted to hear. He sent back to John signs of a better day for humankind here and now in this world. The oppressed set free, the poor having the gospel preached to them. Good news preached to the poor. What is the good news that the poor want to hear? Now, Bonhoeffer would say Jesus gave a penultimate answer to what may have been for John an ultimate question. But nevertheless, it was the question, or the answer, that Bonhoeffer himself wanted to hear. And it is in this context that I feel that there can be a resolution between the Stringfellows and the Meads of our society. And as I say, I have the greatest of respect for them both. It is in this context that the person who has a kind of ultimate concern which is beyond this world can really care at the same time about the religion of the Republic. He can give himself to the task of achieving liberty and justice for all and care so much about it that he sees practically the very meaning of life in these terms. But he can give himself to this task so totally and so free of the fear of its ultimate failure because he feels this liberation from bondage to sin, to his own past, and to the fear of death. In other words, because of the transcendent dimension, this transcendent religious dimension, which seems for me to be rather particularistic, a person can embrace the religion of the Republic and participate with others in the realization of its goals. That's it. Thank you. And I'm now open to questions and comments and all the rest. Yes?
Could you discuss some of the individuals who founded the concept of the religion of the Republic and what they brought from the Enlightenment to it?
Yeah.
And I also was wondering if you could hit how someone like Thomas Jefferson can sort of resolve his concept of the religion of the Republic with the fact that he was a slave owner.
Well, I'm not sure that I can do that because I'm not Thomas Jefferson, and I don't know that much about it. I do know that, well, let's start out with the religion of the Republic and the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, I would insist, begins in the early part of the 17th century with Lord Edward Herbert of Cherbury, the brother of the famous country pastor George Herbert. Lord Herbert of Cherbury was British ambassador, or English ambassador, I'm sorry. Scotland's another country still, though they both have the same crown. But he is the British ambassador to the court of France in Paris. And from that perspective, he could see the awful results of the so-called 30 Years' War on the continent of Europe and the so-called wars of religion within France. And he was appalled by this. And so he said, if we can simply affirm as a kind of ecumenical religion, the religion of reason, we can get rid of these ideological wars. And he felt that the religion of reason involved a belief in God as a creator, who was a God of justice and who expected justice from humankind. And though one didn't always see justice in this world, one could have confidence that God would set it straight, at least in the next. And that this religion, he believed, was something that you could derive from the principles of reason and the reason alone. And he also was convinced that these points were affirmed by every Christian group, Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox, that these points were affirmed by Jews and by Muslims, and they were just beginning to hear from Jesuit missionaries about Confucius, and he felt they were affirmed by him too. So this was a universal religion, and that people could come to some kind of unity on this basis. Now, in one form or another, this is what Franklin and Jefferson and other founders of the American Republic inherited. Now, I'm not saying that every constitutional father was an Enlightenment person committed to this kind of religion. But those who were not committed to this at least accepted that and would say, well, there should be something more too. And so Benjamin Franklin says that's fine. And he gave a little money to every church that came into existence in Philadelphia because each one taught at least this. And he didn't care about what else they taught, you see. So he was able to favor all churches, you know, because of this essential thing, which was the religion of reason. Now, I cannot answer all the questions of the contradictions, except that I would say, first of all, that I think these people were not aware of how much this religion of reason is based upon the biblical tradition. In other words, it's not the kind of religion of reason that would have grown up in India, in Hindu soil, and so on. They weren't quite aware of that. But as far as the contradictions are concerned with slavery, we do know, of course, that Jefferson hoped, he had faith in the future. He realized that slavery was wrong. And he had faith in the future that someday Americans would be able to rid the land of this slavery. But he felt himself powerless to do so. And we find him doing odd things, like not freeing his own enslaved son in his will, you see, because to do so would mean he could no longer live in Virginia. And that would be too bad, wouldn't it? There are these contradictions, certainly, and there are more than this, of course. Abigail Adams brought up to her husband John about the contradiction of liberty and justice for all, and all people being created equal as long as they were male, you know, and that females were not equal. And Abigail says, look, John, if you don't write this into the Constitution, that women too are equal with respect to fundamental rights, someday you're going to have a real revolution on your hands, you know. And John thought it was kind of a joke. From William Stringfellow's point of view, this is sin. This is why you have the contradiction. Even the most enlightened person is not freed from that kind of self-centered view of the universe, you see. In other words, they affirm a universalistic position, but when the chips are down again and again, they will have a very narrow point of view. And I think the good thing is that at least they affirm the universalistic position on paper, so it got into the Declaration of Independence and to some degree in the Constitution, so that eventually we're able to affirm today, without feeling that we're in contradiction with our ancestors, that all people, black, Amerindian, female, are truly equal with respect to fundamental rights. Is this okay? That's the best I can do. The human personality is a strange and wonderful thing, and people live with contradictions always. Yes?
Professor Spaulding, I think it's, the religion of the Republic was really born in a time when this was a fairly homogeneous society culture, with the most glaring exception being the institution of slavery. And also at a time when institutions were not as coercive as they are today, which roles were perhaps not as rigidly defined as they are today. And I'm just kind of wondering if we can really rely on any hope for a religion of the Republic in any kind of general sense. I mean, it just seems to me
Sure.
that the context has really changed.
Yeah. One of the things that is
Really kind of a society
is of great,
which is really divided by
yeah.
many particularistic
Yeah. One of the things interesting to me is how the Roman Catholics were able to affirm this religion of the Republic at the time of the American Revolution. And this bothered this man I was talking about this afternoon. He felt the Presbyterians and the Catholics were ganging up on him, in this revolution in Maryland. But they really were, and I find this often comes as a surprise to the contemporary Roman Catholic to find this great Maryland tradition, which associates the two so well. They were able to bridge this, and certainly I don't think a Jew has any trouble with it because it comes right out of the Hebrew Bible, the religion of the Republic. In fact, Roland Bainton, the Quaker historian, in his book Christendom, he says the religion of America is, of course, Judaism, because this is the basis upon which all the different groups are able to come together, the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, now I know what you're talking about. You're talking about today, and it's a tougher situation, and the state is more demonic because it's bigger and has technical power in its hands, and all the rest. And I do think it is true that the individual cannot expect to get very far qua individual in opposing this. And so he must somehow get himself into groups which somehow are able to get some kind of power to move against other groups with power and keeping some kind of balance. And of course, I heartily recommend still at this day, Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man in Immoral Society as a kind of practical way to approach the present situation. But I am not willing to go all the way with Stringfellow in seeing the state as simply demonic. I mean, so much has changed for the better, too, in terms of human rights in the last 20 years. Wouldn't you say this? I think you're an old ACLU proponent, and there have been some things, and this same state, which is so often demonic, has also been helpful in getting rights for the oppressed. And there is some hope.
Perhaps I'm bothered here with some of the same question I was following was asked over here, though. Your resolution of the tension seems to be dependent upon finding some signs of progress, revolution within a society, and thinking back to that work you had among the Dakota Sioux and the
Oh, boy.
Reservation. Why, here you have that lost people you talked about that still are lost.
Oh, there is such a change. There is such a change in the last 30 years. It's over 30 years now, that I am so heartened. When I lived there on the Dakota Indian Reservation where we lived, it just broke me up to find these sons and daughters of the Knights of the Plains, you know, meeting you in town and hanging their head and talking out of the side of the mouth, because white people had forced them into that kind of pattern. And I would get out into their own community, you know, and they would put their shoulders back. And I saw blacks doing the same thing. When I was a member of the NAACP in Little Dixie down in Missouri, I'd see a man, you know, it'd be Yazzaboss, sweeping out the banks, and he would chair the NAACP meeting with his shoulders squared, his eye on the future, and working for a better day for his grandchildren, you know. And it broke me up, the stereotype that the Dakota Indian and the American black were forced into by their white overlords. But today, those same people aren't filling those stereotypes, and it gets the whites awfully nervous, you know, when the Dakota Indian comes in, you know, and strums a guitar and sings a freedom song, you know, and his shoulders square. There's been a big change. And I think people are divided into two parts. There are the apocalyptic. I've got to go along with Moltmann here. There are the apocalyptic types, and for them the bad news is the good news, you know, because that means that the end's that much closer when everything goes to pieces and their worst fears are fulfilled. And then there are the other types where there is some good news. You may have to look hard for it, but it's there. Oh, don't put me in that class. Don't put me in that class. But there is some good news, and it doesn't always get on the front page. But when you're talking about Dakota Indians, hey, there's good news. There's been something happening in the last generation. It's great. It's great. And I'm just sorry I don't have one here to tell you that, so you can see the difference. This is an awful white audience here. I mean, we don't have the expression from these other groups.
Lately, I have
Well, I think, first of all, that you can vote for those spokesman for the people who are willing to admit that we were wrong in Vietnam. And you have an opportunity to do that right here in Ames, Tuesday morning. There is a difference between the people who are running for office, and some are willing to admit this and some are not, that we were wrong in Vietnam. If you want their names, I can give them to you.
But now, I mean, will the religion of the Republic help us to do that as much as the particularistic religion?
I would insist that in the religion of the Republic you have the prophetic word spoken, and I refer, it's harder to find, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, and even Jefferson on this slavery. He did write an essay on Negro slavery, as he called it. This was the title. And he said in it, "The thought that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever makes me tremble." Now that comes out of this Enlightenment religion of the Republic, and that speaks the word that you're asking for. And we need people who are willing to speak that today. I'm just sorry that Jimmy Carter felt he had to call up Mrs. Johnson and say he was sorry. He was right the first time, in Playboy even.
Well, wasn't the way the U.S. got into Vietnam part of the idea of trying to do what is right?
Yes, indeed. And of course, this is one of the problems. There's no one in a greater bondage to sin than the person who assumes that he is always right. And we have somehow got into that. But I would insist even here that we have had spokesmen within the religion of the Republic, like Abraham Lincoln, you know, who was able to carry through on a terribly bitter war without this sense that somehow we're the right side, they're the wrong side, you know. And he had this sense of humility. And we have a model here, which I think is useful today, still. It's still useful. And sure, it's a terrible thing when we get to thinking that we're the world savior, you know, or something like that. Let me go back again to the people of Israel. When they saw that they had this opportunity, you know, to relate the message of freedom to the whole world, it was without quenching the smoking flax, without breaking the bruised cattail. I can't think of anything weaker than a cattail that has a bruise on it. In other words, it isn't by force of arms, but it's by the spoken word and the living witness of the deed, you see. And this is something we need to learn, and that we are far more effective in influencing Vietnamese or anybody else by practicing what we preach in the religion of the Republic. Ho Chi Minh used to keep Abraham Lincoln's picture over his desk. You know, that was his inspiration. We supported Ho Chi Minh when it was the Japanese he was fighting against, you know. And then we betrayed him. And then we said, hey, he's gone over to the lousy communists, you know, we got to fight him now. We just did the same thing in Angola. The present president of Angola, Agostinho Neto, is the son of a Methodist preacher. He was trained and raised in American religion there. This is why he had the yearning for freedom. 5 years ago, the Methodist bishop of Angola had him over in this country trying to get him some kind of hearing in the State Department. This all came out in the hearings before Senator Dick Clark's Committee on African Affairs. Trying to get him some hearing in Washington. Nobody would open a door for him. Nobody wanted to listen to him. We were then supplying the Portuguese with arms to keep the people down. Well, where was he to turn for help to rid his country of their Portuguese colonial overlords? And he turned to Russia, and he turned to Fidel Castro. You see, and then oh, he's a terrible communist, you know. Pardon me? it depends on your point of view. He doesn't think so. He doesn't think so, and I just have listened to him. ABC recently did quite a study here, television. Yeah, I will agree if indeed he allows Russia to dominate his thinking. Sure.
There are, I'm not gonna say it, that it is so right now, because there's not enough information coming from that.
That's right. But the point is, I would make, we really muffed it there.
We did.
Okay, and let's admit it, and not try to defend what we did. And if he does get into subjection to Russia, who is to blame? Part of the blame is ours. And we're the ones that we have to worry about in this matter of guilt.
I was going to go back to Vietnam.
Sure.
And its relationship, like say with the Civil War. In the early 60s, as I remember it, the newspapers and news magazines were quite often carrying stories about how the Viet Cong in particular were using terror tactics
Mhm.
to get the people, though, to fall into line in supporting them. And so that we were, in that respect, going to fight for the oppressed, free the oppressed from the oppressors.
Yeah, but our involvement in Vietnam goes back before 1945. This is the point. It was in those days that Ho Chi Minh had Abraham Lincoln as his model. We muffed it because at the end of the Second World War, we, with our planes and our troops, forced the French back upon the Vietnamese and produced this kind of condition that you're talking about, and we share the guilt for that atrocity that you're talking about. And this is what we have to recognize.
So you're talking back to the 40s and 50s, not 60s mistakes.
I'll take the 60s too, but you have to take the whole view. You can't just, history has some depth to it. It isn't something, Chairman of the History Department.
But were we wrong in trying to help the oppressors against the oppressors in the 60s?
Well,
Would it be a matter of tactics rather than the reasons therefore?
well, I wish Tom Harkin were here because he has a little personal experience there which he can share with you about the 60s. And I was not there, and I'll have to admit that. But we were lied to a great deal. We were lied to by Eisenhower and Dulles and by Johnson and by Kennedy and by Nixon and by McNamara and so on and so forth. And all I can say is read Fire in the Lake and The Best and the Brightest, and then come back and we'll talk about this again, providing you've read those two books.
I might point out one thing along those same lines to show how much our experts really know. Daniel Ellsberg, a supposed expert on Indochina, didn't even know about the Geneva Accords until he discovered the Pentagon Papers. And that's really getting at a point I raised a little earlier, is that I think that society is so complex and fragmented that I don't think there can be any shared.
I think we have one more question.
Yeah.
Gary?
Well, I was just going to raise the sort of, discomforting tension that seems to exist in the concept of freedom between the need to be an advocate on behalf of that for which one stands for, and the implicit need in freedom to allow the irresponsible to exist, or to allow for the kind of diversity so that I must protect the rights of those who are, quote, wrong. And when one is, coming out of, a firm biblical faith, sometimes it's difficult to live in that kind of tension because it's very easy to slip into that, the side of it of advocacy of that which is right, or that which is my own.
Well, just remember the person who got condemned for associating with prostitutes and other rejected people, who were clearly wrong too, but yet this did not cause him to break off this concern for their rights as human beings. And again, I know we have a person who's lived long with the ACLU, and very often the people you have to defend, I'm sure, are people that it's kind of uncomfortable to be around. But unless those rights are defended, we lose our rights too. This is one thing I'm convinced of. And we've got to be concerned with the human rights of all, including people who do things that are wrong, and except at that point where clearly this wrong they're doing is doing harm, you know, physical and mental harm to other human beings. And sure, we have to have laws. We have to have laws that, and all of us need them, not just one class of society. If they didn't have speed limit laws and red lights and so on, we'd be in trouble. And we need those because of me and you, and not just some kind of peculiar kind of lawless individual.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention.